The Iraq War began in 2003. The United States, led by President George W. Bush, accused Iraq and its leader, Saddam Hussein, of possessing weapons of mass destruction. These weapons, the U.S. claimed, posed a threat to the world. This claim was based on intelligence reports, some of which were later found to be flawed. The U.S. also argued that Saddam Hussein's regime was linked to terrorism. This connection was made after the September 11, 2001 attacks. However, no direct evidence was ever found to support this claim. Despite these concerns, the decision to invade Iraq was highly controversial. Many countries and people around the world opposed the war. They questioned the evidence presented by the U.S. government. Protests erupted globally. Millions marched in opposition to the looming conflict. Despite this, the Bush administration pressed forward. On March 20, 2003, the U.S., along with a coalition of allies, launched Operation Iraqi Freedom. The invasion marked the beginning of a long and costly war. For more stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe to MGOT Vistory Warfare. The invasion of Iraq began with a massive aerial bombardment, dubbed Shock and Awe. The U.S. military targeted key infrastructure. Command and control centers were destroyed. Airfields were bombed. The goal was to cripple Iraq's ability to defend itself. On the ground, U.S. and coalition forces advanced rapidly. They faced little resistance in the early days. The Iraqi army, weakened by years of sanctions and internal divisions, was ill-prepared for the onslaught. Within weeks, U.S. forces had reached the outskirts of Baghdad. The Iraqi capital was the ultimate prize. Its capture would symbolize the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime. On April 9, 2003, U.S. forces entered Baghdad. They met with sporadic resistance, but the city fell quickly. In a symbolic moment, a statue of Saddam Hussein was toppled in Firdos Square. This event was broadcast around the world. It seemed to mark the end of the dictator's rule. However, the reality on the ground was far more complex. The fall of Baghdad did not mark the end of the war. The initial euphoria of victory soon faded. Iraq, instead of embracing liberation, descended into chaos. The power vacuum left by the collapse of Saddam Hussein's regime created a breeding ground for instability. Looting and lawlessness became widespread. The U.S. occupation authorities struggled to maintain order. Adding to the turmoil was the disbanding of the Iraqi army by the U.S. Thousands of well-trained and heavily armed soldiers were suddenly unemployed and disgruntled. Many of them joined the growing insurgency. The insurgency was a diverse and complex movement. It included former Baathists loyal to Saddam, Sunni nationalists, and foreign jihadists. The insurgents used a variety of tactics, including suicide bombings, roadside bombs, and ambushes. The violence escalated steadily, plunging Iraq into a spiral of sectarian bloodshed. The city of Fallujah, located in the Sunni Triangle west of Baghdad, became a focal point of the insurgency. In April 2004, 4 American contractors were brutally killed in Fallujah. Their bodies were mutilated and hung from a bridge. This gruesome act shocked the world and galvanized the insurgency. The U.S. military launched a major offensive to retake the city. The First Battle of Fallujah was a brutal affair. U.S. Marines faced fierce resistance in house-to-house fighting. The insurgents used civilians as human shields, making it difficult for the Americans to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. The battle raged for weeks, resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. In the end, the U.S. military withdrew from the city center, allowing the insurgents to regroup and rearm. The Second Battle of Fallujah, launched in November 2004, was even more intense. This time, the U.S. military was determined to crush the insurgency in Fallujah. The city was subjected to a massive bombardment. U.S. forces used overwhelming firepower, including tanks, artillery, and airstrikes. The insurgents fought back fiercely, but they were no match for the superior firepower of the Americans. After weeks of fighting, Fallujah was declared secure. The city lay in ruins and thousands of civilians were killed or displaced. By 2006, the situation in Iraq had deteriorated into a full-blown civil war. Sunni and Shiite militias were engaged in a brutal sectarian conflict. Car bombings, suicide attacks, and death squad killings became daily occurrences. The U.S. military, bogged down in a seemingly unwinnable war, was taking heavy casualties. In a desperate attempt to salvage the situation, President Bush announced a new strategy in January 2007, the surge. The surge involved deploying an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Iraq. These troops were concentrated in Baghdad and other volatile areas. The goal was to improve security, restore order, and create space for political reconciliation between Sunnis and Shiites. The surge was controversial. Critics argued that it was too little, too late. However, the surge had a significant impact on the security situation. Violence levels decreased dramatically in Baghdad and other areas. The surge is credited with averting a complete collapse of Iraq. However, it did not solve the underlying political and sectarian divisions that fueled the conflict. The Iraq War exacted a devastating toll on the country. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed. Millions more were displaced from their homes. The country's infrastructure lay in ruins. The war also had a profound impact on Iraqi society. It exacerbated sectarian tensions, fueling a cycle of violence and revenge. The conflict created deep divisions within Iraqi society, making it difficult to rebuild and reconcile. The war also had a corrosive effect on Iraqi politics. Corruption flourished, sectarianism poisoned the political process. The war also had a lasting impact on the region. It destabilized the Middle East. The chaos in Iraq also created a breeding ground for extremist groups such as ISIS. The human cost of the war was immeasurable. The conflict left behind a legacy of trauma, loss, and displacement. The war also had a profound impact on the U.S. In 2008, President Barack Obama was elected on a platform of ending the Iraq War. He fulfilled his campaign promise. In December 2011, the last U.S. troops withdrew from Iraq. The withdrawal marked the end of the U.S. military involvement in Iraq, but it did not bring an end to the conflict. Iraq remained a deeply divided and unstable country. Sectarian violence continued. Corruption was rampant. The Iraqi government struggled to provide basic services to its people. In 2014, ISIS, a Sunni extremist group that had emerged from the chaos of the Iraq War, swept across Iraq, capturing vast swaths of territory. The Iraqi army, poorly trained and equipped, crumbled in the face of the ISIS onslaught. The U.S. was forced to intervene militarily once again, launching airstrikes against ISIS targets and providing support to Iraqi and Kurdish forces. The fight against ISIS lasted for several years. Finally, in 2017, ISIS was declared defeated in Iraq. However, the group remains a threat, and its ideology continues to inspire violence. The Iraq War was a defining event of the 21st century. It is a war that continues to shape the world today. Like and subscribe to MGOT Vistry Warfare for more stories.